Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Joanna. And this is Growing Home Together.
Caring for the soul of your family, helping you grow closer to God.
And each other. Thank you for joining us today at the Growing Home Together podcast. You already know that we're passionate about growing happy, healthy marriages and about the power of God to work in our homes.
So today we are so excited to welcome Bryan and Shayla Moffitt. Through their ministry, Anguished Hearts, they show how God can take a marriage from the brink of divorce and transform it to become stronger than ever before. We can't wait for you to hear the story of how God redeemed their relationship and is now using them to help couples everywhere. They're speakers, writers, and marriage mentors who show us how to follow Jesus as husbands and wives.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Bryan and Shayla. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us on this awesome podcast.
Yeah. Hey guys, we're great to be with you today and honored that you invited us to join you.
Yeah, well, we're excited to hear your story. I was doing a little research for our blog, and I came across your ministry, and I was just so encouraged by what you guys are doing and by your story. And so I would love for you to just start and tell us about your journey together. You've been married, I think, 20 years now?
Yes, we celebrated the big 20 last December. So, that's a long time. 20 years is a long time. And so December was our 20-year anniversary, and we've got a couple kids. We got an 11-year-old daughter, Addison, and an 8-year-old son, Kason, and family of 4. We live in Kansas City, Missouri.
That's great. So, tell us how congratulations on the 20 years, by the way. Mm-hmm. That's great. So tell us a little bit about your story together.
So our story started, we were both very young and in love. I was 19 and Bryan was 22 when we got married. And oh man, we thought we had life figured out, right? I mean, you do at that age.
Right. We were married at just about the same age as I was barely 20 and Rob was 22. So we'd feel ya.
What were our parents thinking, by the way?
I know.
And we just, our relationship from the very beginning, from the moment we locked eyes in the mailroom at our college, our relationship was very intense. There was no boundaries in our relationship, and we were young, we were in love, we got married. Let's see, we dated for eight months, and then we got engaged, and then 5 months later got married. So it was very, very rapid, very quick. But like I said, we had life figured out, and we had no solid foundation starting out our marriage. I grew up in a very strong Christian home. I'm the youngest of 4. So when I left home, I was running out of the house for freedom. And, looking back, my childhood was amazing. I didn't have any hiccups growing up. I didn't have any, hard times that caused me to kind of have scars, later on in life. But, my parents celebrated 53 years of marriage. So I had a mom and a dad and a family that anytime that the church doors were open, man, we were there. And so I had a solid foundation of growing up in a Christian home. But the moment I left for college, I put all of that on a shelf in a box, and I left that actually at my home. I never took any of those beliefs with me. I never took any of those morals or those values with me to college. And then I met Bryan. Like I said, in college, we had an accelerated dating engagement, and then we got married. And, man, those first couple of years of marriage, they were hard, but we were together. And we made a move. We not only did we get married, but we moved from Wichita, Kansas to Kansas City. And we were leaving family behind. So we were kind of starting our own legacy. But during those first couple of years of marriage, we went through some really, really hard times.
Yeah. So where were you? Were you seeking God at all at this point, or like you said, was that still on the shelf at this point, or?
Yeah, 100%. It was still on the shelf. Brian and I, we never even talked about, hey, should we go to church on Sunday? Unfortunately, the lifestyle that we were living, it didn't allow us to get up early on a Sunday morning. We were usually crawling into bed at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning from a night out. Our lifestyle was pretty crazy. And we never talked about church. Never once did we say, hey, husband and wife, maybe we should go to church on a Sunday. The only time that we would go to church would be when my parents would come and visit us for a weekend. And I'll date ourselves a little bit. We would look through a book called a phone book, and we would find the closest church
Right.
to our house or our apartment. And we would put on this mask, and yeah, we go to church here. So again, kind of living this double life of, for me growing up in a strong Christian home to now, there was no God, there was no Jesus in my life. I was living selfishly for Shayla and selfishly for our marriage at this point.
Okay.
So yeah, no, I mean, great question. There was not even a talk about, should we go to church?
Right. Well, Shayla, it does sound like you had a pretty strong Christian foundation built underneath you from your family. But Bryan, that might not have been the case for you, right?
Yeah, that's right. My story is a little bit different. I grew up in a single mom, single family home for most of my childhood. My biological father was gone at the age of 5, and then my mom remarried at the age of, I was 8, and then she was divorced again at the age of 18. And so I had a stepdad in that 10-year time period, but he wasn't always in the picture as well. So it was a much different childhood than Shayla. We went to church from time to time. Really, I always say that's because that's what you do in small town Kansas. You go to church on a Sunday morning. But I really don't remember any type of prayer in the home. I don't remember any conversations wrapped around, what does it look like to live a life following Jesus? What does it look like to pray together as a family? That just wasn't part of my story growing up. For me, being the oldest of 4, Shayla talked about being the youngest. I was the oldest, and even at the age of 5, when my biological father was out of the picture, there was all of a sudden this burden on my shoulders of being the man of the house at the age of 5. And I just remember that responsibility. And not that it was expected, but I think it was maybe some self-imposed expectations on myself, even at such a young age. And then when my stepfather came into the picture for that 10-year window, a little more, there was a father figure around. But again, it wasn't a situation where he was guiding and leading. And looking back, I can see that their relationship wasn't the healthiest. And so it was a struggle those 10 years. There was a small window in there. I was in 7th grade, and there was a gentleman that played basketball at the local university, and he became like a big brother and a father figure to me, somebody that I could look up to. And he had passed away 2 years into that friendship. He died in a car accident. And so had my biological father was gone at the age of 5. And then this role model father figure was gone at the age of 14. And then my stepfather was gone at the age of 18. So there was a pattern of men coming into my life and then being gone. And so when I met Shayla in college, like she mentioned, it was super intense from the get-go. We clicked right away. And people look at our story and say, well, did you guys ever get along? And our answer is we did. We got along great. We just had our priorities backwards. And as she mentioned, we spent a lot of our time chasing the wrong things. Very destructive behavior was really the theme of our early in our relationship.
So as things moved on with you, how would you say the absence of a relationship with Christ affected your relationship with each other?
That's a great question, because when you build your marriage on quicksand, it quickly crumbles. And, we were about 5 years into our marriage, and you would have never known this because we were living the American dream. We both had two great jobs. We had built a house. We had two brand new cars in the garage. We had a boat. It was the American dream. I mean, people looking in saw this picture of a perfect marriage, of a perfect household. But what people did not see and what they did not know was the devastation that was happening within the four walls of that brand new house with those brand new cars, the brand new boat. We had two dogs, two cats. I mean, they didn't know what was happening. And what was happening in the walls or within the house, within those four walls, was just a marriage that was quickly crumbling. We were focused on things other than Christ. We were focused on more careers. We were focused on money. We were focused on what brought us happiness. And Bryan traveled for his job. And what started to happen was the more he would travel, the more independent I became, because I was the one at home, and I was mowing the lawn and I was doing the grocery shopping because he would be traveling for work, Monday through Friday, and then he would come home for a weekend and maybe go on a fishing trip and then be gone again Monday through Friday for work. And what was happening during this time was Satan was just working on both of our hearts. I would get angry with Bryan, like, you're never home, you're never around, do you not love me? And he loved being away. He loved being away from the chaos that was happening in our home. And, he was on a business trip in December, and we had just celebrated our 6-year wedding anniversary, and he came home from that business trip, and he was so incredibly angry with me. When Bryan would travel, he would find himself in bars and drinking very heavily, and I would sit at home and I would worry about him, and I would call him over and over and over, repeatedly every night. Are you in your hotel room? Are you safe? And this particular evening, he was not answering his phone. He wasn't answering his hotel phone, and I thought, this is the night. This is the night that he has been in a car wreck, and they have no way of getting a hold of me. And the next morning he woke up and he was angry with me because I had called his cell phone all night long. And he came home that night, and we hopped in our vehicle and we drove to my parents' house, which is in Southwest Kansas. And that's about an 8.5-hour trip. And if you know anything about Kansas in the winter, you're always guaranteed a good blizzard. And we got about halfway into our trip, and we hit the biggest blizzard that I think hit Kansas that year. Mm-hmm. And when we left Kansas City, we didn't utter a word to each other. I was so hurt by his actions of not caring enough to answer his phone. He was so angry that I was nagging him, running his life, controlling where he was going while he was, on business trips. And that 8.5-hour trip ended up being a 12.5-hour trip. And about 30 minutes before we got to my home that I grew up in, with a mom and dad that loved each other, and my 3 siblings, Bryan says to me, "Shayla, I don't love you. I don't want to be with you anymore. I want out." 30 minutes before walking into home to celebrate a week of Christmas with my family.
Well, that had to be devastating.
I didn't have the best timing, did I, guys?
Yeah, well, it not to make light of it, but it sounds like a good scene from a movie while you're driving in this blizzard, and there's a storm going on in the silence of the car, But that's amazing. So what was going through your mind, Bryan, during this time? I mean, you said you wanted out, but what was your process through that?
I mean, think back. I mean, we're talking 15 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. And I can put myself back in that car like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
That's how fresh it is. We talk a lot about sticky note moments in life. When you have a sticky note, you write down things on a sticky note that you don't want to forget, and you place it somewhere that you don't overlook. And in life, we have sticky note moments as well. And sometimes they're good sticky notes, and sometimes they're bad sticky notes. And that particular drive is a sticky note moment that I'll never forget, and nor will Shayla, about the emotions that we felt driving 12 hours through this snowstorm. And Rob, you made a good point. It's like that scene in a movie where there's this chaos going all around, and the only way that you know how to get out of it is to jump. Mm-hmm. And that's really what I felt. I felt like I was at the end of the road. There was no way out, and the only way to have some sort of relief was to blurt out those three statements. I don't love you, I don't want to be married to you, and I want out. And who in the right mind would say that to their wife literally 20 minutes before getting to mom and dad's house for Christmas? But right. In that moment, I didn't know what else to do.
Right. So Shayla, you're what is going through your mind at this time as you're how do you process something like that?
I knew things in our marriage, they were not good. But I did not realize that they were that bad. And, getting hit with those three statements, I just kept thinking, I'm going to wake up from this bad dream. Because I guess I didn't realize that is how he felt. I didn't grow up in a home where divorce was even, thrown around. I could not imagine being divorced, but things weren't good. And, so we got home and Bryan says to me, hey, what I said to you earlier, just forget about it. And you just don't forget about three very heart-wrenching statements like that. And faked
it. wasn't like I said, hey, I don't like your outfit.
Right.
I mean, oh, by the way, just take those three things that I said 2 hours ago. Just take them. I'm taking them back. I didn't mean them. But again, it was panic of, I can't believe I just said that. I saw the hurt in her eyes and the hurt that I caused, and it was like, okay, never mind. Just forget it. And it was already said. Right.
So you were kind of in limbo with no resolution at that point.
Sure. We faked it all Christmas long. We never went back to that moment, and we never talked about what was said. And I will never forget, Bryan talks about, he can put himself back into the car, and I can, visualize the blizzard. I can put myself back into my home where I was leaving a mom and dad, that there was a home full of love. And I knew that we were going to be driving 8.5 hours back to a house that I didn't know what the future held. And, the car ride back to Kansas City wasn't any better than the car ride home. And what happened was, when we got home, for the next 4 months, we lived separated, but still under the same roof. Bryan traveled more. I realized at this point that our marriage was over. But I didn't want to be the first one to file for divorce, because one, that was never modeled to me. It wasn't an option for my family. And my parents just started praying. They kept saying, we're going to pray that God will work a miracle in your marriage. And I just, I kept saying, you guys don't see it every day. Like, I believe that God is big, but he's not this big. I do not think that God can fix this marriage. And we lived this way for 4 months, and I finally convinced my parents that divorce is what needed to happen. I had I had caught a couple of emails between Bryan and another woman that were they were inappropriate. And when confronted, Bryan admitted to, yeah, I've been talking with her, and kind of like, what's the big deal? So within this 4 months of living separate, under the same roof, my only goal for that 4 months was to make Bryan's life as miserable as possible, because I was a miserable person. And we would leave nasty notes for each other. We would, really mean comments back and forth. Not even something that, we talk about it now. We cannot believe that we would talk like that to each other. But we were both hurting people with no hope. And, my parents just kept saying, I've shared this with our small group. Our small group is praying for you. My parents would send up books for us to read on, how to restore a marriage. But I had given up hope. And so I had filed for divorce. And looking back on that Friday afternoon, sitting in the lawyer's office, I wanted revenge. I wanted Bryan to hurt as deep as I was hurting. And I told the lawyer, I want the house. I want the 2 cars. I want, the dogs, the cats. I want everything. I want all of the money in the bank. All of the things that the American dream brought us. I wanted to rip that from Bryan. And I remember thinking, this isn't my personality type. This isn't who I am, but I wanted revenge. I wanted Bryan to hurt. And in all reality, Bryan was hurting just as bad. And so, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And we were both wrong. And there was no right in this situation. Bryan was gone for a fishing trip that weekend, and my parents had left. And Saturday morning, Bryan comes home early, and I said, "What are you doing? Why are you home?" And he said, "I got a phone call from my mom. My grandma is really sick. She just got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And I'm going to go back and see grandma." And you guys, there was something inside of me that, I had just filed for divorce. He had no clue. He was going to be served the papers. He came home with just this devastating news, because I knew how much his grandmother meant to him. And I said, "Well, I'm going to go back with you to see grandma." And I wish you guys could have seen the look on his face, because he was like, "No way. I am not having you in the car with me for 4 hours to go see grandma." But I did. And that was a little bit of a breaking point in our marriage, because we had realized at that point, man, life is short. Family is important. Like, why are we doing this to each other? And, so I had told him, "Hey, I filed for divorce." And, when we got back from that trip, I put those divorce papers on hold. And Bryan says, we're going to work on this marriage. Like, we're going to make this work. But in all reality, all we were doing was just sweeping all of our junk under a big area rug. We didn't address anything.
So did you hit another turning point between you then, if you were just delaying maybe the inevitable?
Well, I didn't know, right? When we had talked about, on the way home, like, life is short, family is important. Why are we treating each other this way? We didn't address any of the drinking issues. We didn't address the travel for work. And I understood that Bryan had to travel for work. That was, part of his requirements. But it was, "Hey, Bryan, while you're traveling, why are you out all night drinking?" We didn't address any of those things. And I kept going back to my parents saying, "We're going to keep praying for this marriage. Like, this marriage isn't over. We're going to keep praying. We're going to keep praying." And, I would say our marriage wasn't good at all when we got back together. And when I say get back together, it was, he moved from the spare bedroom back into the master bedroom. And, nothing had changed. Like I said, we were still living kind of in this limbo, but there was still questioning in the back of my mind of, is this really going to work?
Yeah. So Bryan, obviously when when you came back and you decided to live separate lives for a while, and then you go to your grandma's funeral, but something about that made you guys decide to work it out, but you didn't really work on some of the root issues. Were you trying to what were you guys trying to hold on to, you think?
Well, growing up in a broken home, I didn't want to be divorced. And as crazy as that sounds, I mean, I told Shayla a few months earlier, I don't love you. I don't want to be married to you. I want out. But there was this tug of war inside my heart of, okay, I committed to this relationship. I love Shayla, but I'm going through this turmoil of wondering there has to be more to life. We were chasing things. We were chasing money, chasing careers, and they were just becoming, you'd reach something and it just wasn't fulfilling. And I think that's where I was. I hit that time in my life of thinking there has to be more to life than this. Waking up every day, going to work, coming home, doing it over and over again. And when my grandmother got sick, she hadn't passed yet. We just found out she had cancer, and so that was an awakening for me of, okay, family is important. But again, like Shayla said, we didn't address any of the issues. So we come back from visiting my grandmother. To give you guys a time frame, this is in April of 2006, and we come back to Kansas City, and at home I would be the husband, but when I would travel, I was still being the same person I was before. Like Shayla mentioned, I was out in the evenings drinking quite a bit, really trying to be gone as much as possible. I wasn't home hardly at all, and that continued throughout the next 4 or 5 months. And again, it was just chasing something else. My grandmother ended up passing away in August, 4 months later. Okay. And I remember I was with her at her farmhouse, and watching her pass away, watching her die the last few days. And again, moments I'll never forget of holding her hand and watching her breathe every day, wondering, is today going to be the day? And I remember thinking to myself, when she passes, whether it's today or tomorrow or next week, it was going to happen. It was inevitable. When she passes, I'll never see her again. And so my grandmother was a strong Christian woman, and I believed that there was a heaven. I believed there was a hell. I believed that there was a God, and I believed that, I would even say I believed that Jesus existed. But what I thought was the fact that if you believed in this stuff, and if you were a good enough person, you'd be welcomed into heaven someday. And in my mind, my grandmother, hey, she's a strong Christian woman. She goes to church. She reads her Bible. She doesn't cuss. She doesn't drink alcohol. She doesn't smoke cigarettes. I mean, all these things, this checklist of things, right? Sure. And I thought, okay, she's going to be in heaven someday. And I knew the life that I was living, and I was fearful that I would never see her again because she would be in heaven and I would not be. Okay. And it was a great awakening. And I remember as they wheeled her out of the farmhouse, and I just remember crying, thinking, of course, tears of sadness because I would never see her again. But I just remember thinking, I will never see her eternally again. And that was tough. That was hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So did that change kind of how you committed to your marriage, or where was your marriage at this point through that pain and that process?
No, Rob and Joanna. See, here's the problem. I need somebody to whack me across the head with a frying pan. I just, it was like one thing after another, and I want to make some light of our conversation because I know our story is so heavy. Yeah. And to the listener, it's like, okay, let's all take a deep breath. Right. Spoiler alert: we made it, right? And
right.
There's grace in this story. And even telling the story, sometimes you forget that. It's like, no, there's grace coming. There's healing. There's healing in the storm. And I wish I could tell you that was the moment, right? My grandmother passes away, and I come home and I tell Shayla, hey, I need to find out how to get to heaven. And this grand, story happened, and it wasn't the case. I had this pattern of just sweeping things under the rug. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did. I took my emotions, I swept them under the rug, and I toughened up, and I said, okay, let's get back to life. And unfortunately, 6 weeks later, or I should say fortunately, they caught up with me.
And how did it do that?
So, man, if you are in a marriage relationship that is not good, you start doing some research, right? And that's what I did. Bryan was traveling, And I would go to work and I would come home and I would just start digging through files. I would dig through, credit card statements. I would dig through phone records. You guys, even though we were living together and we looked like we had it all together, there was just this pit in my stomach. Something was not right. And, if you dig deep enough and hard enough, you will find your answers. And I did that. And it was a Monday morning, and I went to work, and I made a phone call that no wife should ever have to make. I had noticed the same phone number on the phone records, and I had finally gotten enough nerve to call this number, and the lady on the other end of the line confirmed my worst nightmare. And she had told me that she had been in a relationship with my husband, and I had my answer. I had my why. When I kept saying, why is my marriage falling apart? Why is this so hard? Why are we not healing? Again, never thinking, maybe our marriage isn't healthy because we don't have Christ at the center. That wasn't even on my radar, because we weren't living that life of following Christ. But I had my answers, and I came home that day from work, and I came home right after I had made the phone call, and I told Bryan, it is over. I confronted him about the affair. He admitted it. At this point, he knew I knew, and I left. And I'm telling you this, Rob and Joanna, when I left home that day to go stay with a friend, 6 months prior to, in a lawyer's office, I wanted the house. I wanted the 2 cars. I wanted everything. I left that house on that Monday afternoon, and I wanted nothing. I wanted out. I didn't care about the money in the bank. I didn't care about a vehicle. I didn't care about the house. I wanted as far away as I could from the situation. And I remember when I found out what was going on behind my back, a pivotal moment in our story, and I didn't know it at the time, but looking back now, we can see it, was I grabbed my cell phone and I called my dad and I said, Dad, I now know the truth. And I handed my phone to Bryan and I said, Bryan, you tell my dad.
Wow.
And that moment, God was already working so many different ways, but that moment was pivotal for our relationship, because Bryan, when he said the words, I do, he asked my dad, can I call you Dad? Because he didn't have a dad growing up. And I wanted Bryan to break not only my dad's heart, because he broke my heart, but I wanted my dad to be as angry and hurt as I was. And Bryan, when I handed him the phone, Bryan said, I can't tell your dad. And again, going back to that, when you're hurt so badly, you will hurt others. And it was not, looking back, nothing was Christ-like about what I did, but God was, he was already working miracles at that moment.
So what happened next?
We're grateful to Bryan and Shayla for sharing their story of their marriage with us today. God did such a powerful work in their life together that we don't want you to miss even one detail.
So we've decided to split this conversation into 2 episodes so you can hear the full story. Make sure you listen next week to part 2. You won't want to miss a thing.